Welcome to another episode of HSF Conversations, where we discuss theology, spirituality, ministry, and culture, sometimes in a slightly more informal setting. But today we have the opportunity to discuss with Dr. Matthew Pinson his new book, 40 Questions About Arminianism, and which is published with Kregel Academic. And the book has just come out in April. So Dr. Pinson, we're glad to have you. Thank you for joining us. And I wanted to start by asking you to tell us about how this book came about and what got you interested in the subject, and how did you have the opportunity to write it?
Well, I was asked to write an endorsement for Sean Wright's book in this same series that was entitled 40 Questions About Calvinism. And so I mentioned to Ben Merkel, I said, if you ever want to do something on 40 Questions About Arminianism, I'd like to think about that. And so he ran it up the flagpole at Kregel Academic, and they said that would be a great thing for us to do. And so he came back to me and said they would be very interested in doing the project. And, they have been very helpful, and I've never had a better group of people to work with. Ben Merkel was extremely helpful to me, and they've been very supportive of the project. That's kind of how it came about, and I was able to get them to publish it, and it's been very well received.
Good. Yeah, I've certainly enjoyed the book. So let's jump into the content of the book a bit. So in the book, you contend that Arminius fits squarely within the Reformed tradition. And so you can correct me, but I think what you often refer to your theological view as Reformed Arminianism, as do many others now. But how is it that you see Arminius fitting squarely within the Reformed tradition, and maybe the way in which the definition of Reformed might have changed, let's say, after the Synod of Dort?
Yes, I remember reading when I was a very young scholar, the first time I ever encountered the word the term Reformed Arminianism was from Dr. Robert Piccirilli in his preface to Leroy Forline's commentary on Romans. And he said that one could say that the viewpoint of Jacobus Arminius could be referred to as Reformed Arminianism. And pretty soon, Dr. Piccirilli, after receiving a lot of funny looks from his Calvinist friends, he changed to Reformation Arminianism. But a lot of people kept using that term that he first used back in 1987 of Reformed Arminianism, and it began to catch on. Stephen Ashby was very insistent that we call his viewpoint Reformed Arminianism when he wrote a chapter on that subject for me in my book, Four Views on Eternal Security, back about 20 years ago. And so, the term has just kind of caught on. And basically what Dr. Piccirilli meant by that was that Arminius was a very self-consciously Reformed minister and a Reformed theologian who had an appointment in a Reformed university and was acknowledged as a Reformed pastor and theologian. And the 16th century context, as Carl Bangs and many others have borne out, was really different among the Reformed churches, especially in the Netherlands, but across Europe and even in the British Isles in the 16th century. When things began to change in Reformed theology was in the late 16th century, when you might say, I sometimes jokingly say that a young, restless, and Calvinist community began to gain more and more steam in the late 16th century, when a lot more students began to study at academies and universities like the University of Geneva, and began to come back into the Reformed churches as young pastors and young thinkers, very much convinced of a sort of Bayesian Calvinism that was much stronger and much more like the later post-Dort Calvinism that would become ensconced in the 17th century. So what you have is this growing acceptance of what we, after Dort, came to know as Reformed theology, and it coheres with that 5-point Calvinism that you see in the canons of Dort. But prior to the Synod of Dort in 1618 and 19, you have a much broader understanding and a much more moderate understanding of Reformed theology. Reformed theology is seen much more as in distinction with Anabaptism, or in distinction of course, the main the theological distinction is in contradistinction to the Roman Church, but also in contradistinction to Lutheran theology. So that Reformed is really more of an ecclesiological term. The things that distinguished the Reformed from the Lutherans is not really so much details of soteriology as it is details of ecclesiology, things about how worship is to be conducted, and whether you can use images, or whether you do the sign of the cross in worship, and Eucharistic views with the very strong real presence view that you see in Lutheranism. So, for example, in the Netherlands, early in the Reformation, you have people who are proteges of folks like Philip Melanchthon. Philip Melanchthon was the chief protege of Luther. And so, for example, he had a protege named Albert Hardenberg, who was a Dutch theologian and a Dutch pastor. And Hardenberg basically couldn't hang with Melanchthon on ecclesiological issues. The things that were the most distinctive about Reformed theology in comparison with Lutheranism, which was a different view of the Eucharist, a different view of the presence of Christ in the supper, a different view, a much more simple and a much more simple view of worship, with a lot of the ceremony of the late medieval Catholic Church cut away a lot more so than you saw in Lutheranism. And so, in a sense, people like Hardenberg were saying, we're Reformed, and the reason we're not Lutheran is not because of our soteriology. It's not because of what we believe about these issues regarding predestination and whether grace is resistible or irresistible, or whether whether it's particular or universal. That's not what distinguishes us from Lutheranism. What makes us Reformed is our views on the church and differences that we have with Lutherans and with Anabaptists and with others on the doctrine of the church. So I think that what you're seeing is a hardening in the late 16th century of the way people begin to see Calvinism, what we know now as the 5 points of Calvinism, or soteriological Calvinism, particular grace and irresistible grace. That becomes hardened into that's really what the essence of the Reformed Church is. And many people begin to want to exclude people who don't have those viewpoints that we typically associate with 5-point Calvinism.
Yeah, and it certainly seems as if with the rise of maybe neo-Calvinism or new Calvinism in the last few decades, there has been this emphasis on soteriology, and maybe, I think, definitely to the neglect of ecclesiology. So I'm glad to hear you make that emphasis on what it means to be Reformed is not just what your views are on these minute soteriological points, but also how you view worship. We certainly need a recovery of that. But to ask you about a soteriological point as it relates to Reformed theology and Arminius' place within the Reformed tradition, some scholars have suggested that Arminius maybe has a less than Reformed view of justification. And I know that's something you've given some thought to, so how would you respond to that?
Yes, that's rather unfortunate. The vast majority, the scholarly consensus on Arminius has been that he affirmed a robust Reformed understanding of the imputation of Christ's righteousness. And it's very unusual to have people that will question that. And yet there have been a 2 or 3 Calvinist scholars of late that have kind of resurrected this view of some of Arminius's harsh critics back in the in the early 17th century, like Gomarus and Libertus, and they've kind of resurrected that view and tried to come back and say that Arminius is not really reformed on the doctrine of justification. But what people need to understand is that viewpoint is really in the minority, and it's very hard to sustain that viewpoint. Now, again, a lot of that, the problem comes in when people try to start saying that Arminius is veering from confessional reform theology. You see a lot of that among certain Calvinist historical theologians, and they'll talk about this phrase, confessional reformed theology in the 16th century. And that's kind of where the rub is, because what you find out when you read them more is what they're really talking about is not really confessional reformed theology. They're talking about the details of scholastic theology. And there's no question, even Carl Bangs, who's kind of the historiographical forefather of kind of Reformed Arminianism, is like you've got this historiographical mentor in Bangs, and then kind of the theological mentor in Leroy Forlines, and then the biblical mentor in Robert Pickerilly. But, Bangs is very clear that in Arminius, you have a very reformed understanding of justification and all these other doctrines. And that if you're talking about reformed confessional theology, there's no way that you can say that Arminius contradicted any of the reformed confessional standards, whether his own Dutch confessional standards like the Belgic Confession and the Heidelberg Catechism, or any of the other confessional standards, the confessions and catechisms of the Reformed churches in the 16th century. It wasn't until the 17th century that this growing acceptance of these details about the doctrines of the gratia irresistibilis, the irresistible grace or the particular grace, some of these details begin to be fleshed out and begin to be placed front and center in certain scholastic reformed communities, subcommunities or subcultures. And those begin to gain steam and those begin to become more popular. So Bangs and scholars like that and I have never denied that when you're looking at the mainstream of the growing popularization of what we would think of now as 5-point Calvinist theology, that's growing in popularity in the late 16th century and especially in the early 17th century. But it's important that we distinguish between kind of the speculative theology that you have in the schools and that later becomes more common in 17th century confessional documents. Like, we're familiar with the canons of Dort and the Westminster Confession and the like. And you do start seeing a lot more of those strict Calvinist paradigms and those confessional subtleties that crop up in 17th century Reformed confessions and catechisms. But back in the 16th century, you just don't see that. So it's important that we distinguish between that scholastic theology, which of course Arminius was fully scholastic and everybody was, but that confessional theology that from those confessions and catechisms that were prepared for pulpit and for pew and for catechesis, those are just a lot more broad in these ways, so that it could encompass a Melanchthonian, gratia irresistibilis view, grace being resistible, or a general grace, or gratia universalis, that God is reaching out to everyone, and Christ died for everyone, and Jesus himself is really calling everyone to himself, not just the preacher, but Jesus. And so, those kind of approaches to things are not contradicted by those 16th century Reformed confessions. You can read through all of them. And when you go back and read, that common anthology by Cochrane, it's just, you just see over and over again that, Arminius's views are just really not contradicted by any of those confessions. But back to, but you asked about the justification question. And by the way, I ramble, so just jump in anytime, Jesse, and get me back on track here. But yeah, justification, you had people like Libertus and Gomarus that were saying, they were trying to find a loophole so that they could cast aspersions on Arminius's less than Calvinistic views on things. And so it seemed like they were just aiming at every little thing they could find, any chink in the armor they thought they could find, they would aim at that and try to cast aspersions. And one of the things they landed on was this thing that Arminius had said about the phrase that faith is imputed for righteousness, where it says in Genesis that Abraham believed and it was counted unto him as righteousness, or it was imputed to him as righteousness. And of course, Arminius says, guys, we've just got to take this at face value. It says this in Genesis. It's quoted 4 times in the New Testament, 3 times by Paul and twice by James. And we don't need to play games with this. It's just what it says here. But that does not, he says, that is in no way in contradiction to the fact, to what I affirm, and that is that the meritorious cause of our justification is the righteousness of Jesus Christ only. The obedience and righteousness of Christ, he says, constitute the sole meritorious cause of justification. And so that's very important that you look at what Arminius actually says. What a lot of these, of course, there are only 2 or 3 of them that have even said it, but a lot of these recent Calvinist scholars that have tried to resurrect this viewpoint, they only quote from 2 or 3 places in Arminius on this, where he's talking about, we got to take seriously that the Bible does say faith is imputed for righteousness, but that is not contradictory to what we believe and what the Reformed teachings are on the imputation of the active and passive obedience of Christ in justification, because he does say the obedience and righteousness of Jesus Christ are the sole meritorious cause of justification. And he has several ways that he says that, and he goes to great lengths to say that. And then in his latest statements in the Declaration of Sentiments before the States of Holland, he's very clear that he believes in the righteousness of Christ being imputed to us as our sole basis for justification before God, not our own righteousness. And he just says that is not to be seen as contradicted by the statement of the apostles that and of Genesis, that Abraham believed and it was counted unto him as righteousness. So he just wanted to let the loose ends stay untied, and so Libertus and Gomarus, they jump on that and they see a chink in his armor and something to attack. And that's what some of these more recent scholars, that are excellent scholars, by the way, that's what some of them are doing, and it's unfortunate. But what they're really saying is that Arminius is flying in the face of Reformed confessional theology in his day. And that's just not true. He's flying in the face of some Reformed theologians' construction of the confessional tradition of 16th century Reformed theology. But he's not flying in the face of the confessions or catechisms themselves, nor is he flying in the face of most of the interpretation of theologians of that confessional tradition. Like, for example, when you look at what Heinrich Bullinger says, where he talks very plainly about this issue of Abraham's faith is counted for righteousness. You see him using the same kind of language that Arminius is using, and many of those interpreters before Arminius used that same exact kind of language, and their orthodoxy as Reformed thinkers was never called into question. And so I think we've got to be very careful not to say that Arminius was contradicting Reformed confessional theology. If we want to say that Arminius is contradicting the growing Calvinism you see in Reformed theology in the late 16th century, I think we can say that. I think they're on good grounds to say that. And even to say that he's contradicting what would become ensconced in the Reformed confessional community after the canons of Dort were written in 1619. I think they're on really good grounds to say that. But that's really kind of an anachronistic construction this placed back on Arminius' 16th century and early 17th century context.
Great, thank you so much for that. Hey, I was thinking when I first read the book, when I first started going through it, and especially looking at some of the sections on different issues related to soteriology, one of the things that I noticed that seems somewhat unique to your work, as maybe when compared to some other recent works on Arminianism and Arminian soteriology, is the way in which you put the gospel at the center of some of those soteriological discussions. So I'm thinking particularly about some of the chapters that you have on election and predestination. And one place you discuss Ephesians 1, but you seem to always see these soteriological conversations, again, especially on things like election and predestination, in direct reference to the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So why is it so important to discuss soteriology within the context of the gospel? And then maybe why do you think sometimes, especially maybe in conversations back and forth between Arminians and Calvinists, that the discussion lacks that gospel-centeredness, if we want to call it that?
That's a really good insight. And, the fact is that Arminius was fond of saying that was one of his big concerns about his Calvinist friends and his interlocutors in his context, was that they sort of make the gospel and the work of Christ subsequent, or kind of almost an afterthought, he said, so that when they think about justification and sanctification and the Christian life and soteriology, they are putting the gospel front and center. And indeed, when they think of all of life and all of Christianity, they're putting the gospel in the center. They're gospel centered. But when they begin to talk about predestination, and when they begin to talk about election and the eternal counsels of God, and when they begin to talk, he would say, like, for example, when they begin to talk of regeneration and regeneration preceding faith, then somehow the gospel is not in the center of those conversations. The gospel is in the center of those Calvinist conversations about justification and about living the Christian life and about salvation. But so the way it works its way out in time, the application of the atonement of Christ in time and the plan of salvation in time, he says that's all gospel centered. But when it comes to the eternal counsels of God, that's rarely centered on Christ's work and Christ's merit and what Christ is doing in the gospel. And so he wants to keep the gospel in the center. And he's very much like Melanchthon and the formula of concord of the Lutheran Church in the 16th century there. It's not a whole lot different from that. Arminius is in some ways not really doing anything new or fancy or unusual for mainstream Protestantism of his day. He's simply in a context in the Reformed churches where the Calvinism is becoming a lot more ascendant, and so he's having to deal with that. But he's not really a whole lot different from many of the Lutherans of his day, and even the way Luther began to articulate things later in his life. Luther would say things like, when we begin to get obsessed about the eternal counsels of God, and that somehow God's eternal will in his eternal counsels back before time, but before the creation, are at odds with his will in the gospel. Even Luther would say that's we don't want to go there. The gospel needs to be front and center. That's the way it is for Luther. That's the way it is for Melanchthon. That's the way it is for Arminius. The gospel is front and center. So when we ask, what are the eternal counsels of God? What is God's will? Well, we see God's will in the gospel. We don't have to wonder about what God's will is in some secret will that he has. God has always revealed his will. God has always made known his eternal counsel, his purpose, his will. and it's always made known in the gospel. So his will is that everyone be saved, and his will is that none should perish, and his will is that people should come through Christ and by means of the gospel and be imputed with the merit of Christ and be saved. And so we have to look at the gospel to find out what God's will is. We have to look at the gospel. We can't dichotomize between the gospel and eternity past, between election and eternity past, and the will of God in eternity past, and the counsels of God and the purpose of God in eternity past, and what that will and counsel and purpose is right here and now in time. And so Christ's mediatorial work is not just for getting saved. Christ's mediatorial work, it also has to do with those eternal counsels, that decree in the past. Christ's merit is not some later thing that is brought to bear to make it possible for God to make righteous those that are his elect. Instead, Christ's merit and the gospel and the meaning of the merit of Christ, they are working in God's eternal counsels and his eternal will and his eternal purpose and his good pleasure in eternity past. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yeah. And it seems as if, like you said, that's exactly what Arminius is doing. I mean, if even in the way he conceptualizes maybe the order of salvation, if we want to put it that way, seems to put Christ first in all of those things. And so I think when we're thinking soteriologically, especially about those things that maybe are less clear and less known to us in Scripture, considering them in light of the things that have been revealed to us most plainly, the gospel and what God desires, I think that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and what you said there about the order of salvation and the notion of regeneration preceding faith, it's almost as though that the gospel is an afterthought. Leroy Forlines, my mentor, would often say that you can't have salvation before faith. You can't have life in Christ. Without faith, it is impossible to please him. You can't have life in Christ and sanctification and all these things that go along with regeneration without faith. And so to put regeneration before faith is to get the cart before the horse. And it's basically to make the gospel and the work of Christ and the merit of Christ an afterthought.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to ask you two final questions, and they're very much related. We have a few minutes left. What do you ultimately hope that Calvinist readers of this book will take away? And then what do you hope that Arminian readers of this book will take away?
Well, I hope that both Arminian and Calvinist readers will see that there's a kind of Arminianism, and its basis is in Arminius himself. And I don't agree with Arminius on everything. I mean, I don't think there's anybody that agrees with any of the namesakes of his or her theology that completely agrees with those people. And so there are things about Arminius that I don't like and I disagree with. But I would say that Reformed Arminianism basically is taking its pages out of the playbook of Jacobus Arminius and his the trajectory that he was on. And there's no question that Arminius was working through some things, and he was working through some things in this growing heavily Calvinist context, and was having to deal with things, and some things he was ambiguous on. He didn't quite know what he thought about certain doctrines. But the fact of the matter is that the trajectory that Arminius was on was a much more gracious, much more reformed, much more five solas kind of trajectory than what a lot of later Arminianism got on. Even Arminius's followers, the Remonstrants, very early began to get off track. I would say that the General Baptists recaptured that. What you see in the 17th century in the Remonstrants on the continent, in Anglican theology, in the British Isles, and on that kind of Arminianism gets off track and is much more moralistic and legalistic and even semi-Pelagian in many ways. than what you have with the General Baptists. The General Baptists come the closest of any 17th century thinkers of approximating the trajectory that Arminius was on. They didn't agree with him on every detail. They were more clear than he was. For example, I've come to the conclusion that Arminius was ambiguous about whether you can even fall from grace or not. It's hard to tell where he came down on that. And just about anybody in the apostasy and perseverance conversation can kind of claim Arminius as their own on that issue, because he was kind of asking a lot of questions about that and taking different positions. And I've given up on ever ascertaining, exactly where he finally came down on the doctrine of apostasy. But what you see, the General Baptists, they were very clear on the doctrine of apostasy. But they're the closest to Arminius in terms of the trajectory that he was on. So that's really what I'm hoping that most Arminians and Calvinists will get from this book, is that there's a way to be Arminian that avoids some of the negative points of Arminianism that have grown up through the years, that on a lot of the mainstream expressions of Arminianism that are that converge on semi-Pelagianism. I don't think any real Arminian ever is going to be a semi-Pelagian, but some things that converge on semi-Pelagianism, like, saying that, God just made everybody, he just made total depravity and total inability to completely go away in prevenient grace and things of that nature. I think that if people look into this, if they read this book and they look into this approach to Arminianism, they're going to see an approach that is like Arminius, wanting to keep the farthest possible distance from Pelagianism. They're going to see an approach that is going to hold up the penal substitutionary view of atonement and the imputation of the active and passive obedience of Christ as the sole meritorious cause of our justification. They're going to see a much more rich, reformed understanding of sanctification and the Christian life and spirituality. They're going to see a view that it sort of eschews this mentality of, kind of crisis experiences in spirituality and second work of grace and entire sanctification and the like. And so there's just a lot of things. And, all this Finneyism, all this kind of Finney mentality, which just takes all these things even further. And that's really what a lot of Calvinists see, and a lot of Arminians, as kind of, that's Arminianism. But, there are a lot of people that are beginning to think their way through these things a little bit differently. You have a lot of Arminians that are starting to think, well, I can be a Wesleyan, I can be an Anabaptist, I can be a Christian church, Churches of Christ, a Restorationist or Stone Campbell movement adherent, and I can still be a Reformed Arminian. I can still rejoice in these more Reformed motifs in Arminius' theology. You see that a lot with a lot of the so-called Arminian-leaning Baptists that would believe in certain perseverance of the saints, but they're kind of skeptical of the rest of Calvinism. And they're beginning to look, a lot of them are beginning to say, we really do need to reassert prevenient grace, and the understanding that a special act of God's grace is really necessary for us to desire the things of God in any way. And so it's neat for some of them to start to see that, hey, there's a very gracious, sola gratia, sola fide, soli Deo gloria approach to Arminianism. And then I might just add my little thing. I mean, and it's like I told a buddy of mine recently, Arminianism's a big tent, and Reformed Arminianism's a big tent. And if you want to go out and have a cup of coffee, and go to the barista parlor and sip espresso, well, then we can do that. And there are no membership rules to the discussion. But let's just face it, there are a lot of people that are excited by the fact that you can be reformed on things like epistemology and apologetics and kingdom and eschatology and worship and a number of other beautiful, rich features of the Belgic Confession and the Heidelberg Catechism. And you can be reformed on those things, and there's no problem. You can still be an Arminian.
Well, thank you, Dr. Pinson, for taking the time to discuss your new book, 40 Questions on Arminianism, with us. I certainly encourage our readers and our listeners to get a copy of the book, and I think you'll be greatly benefited by it. Thank you, Dr. Pinson.
Thank you so much for having me.